A black woman boards her first-class seat, expecting nothing more than a peaceful flight. But within moments, everything changes. A flight attendant refuses to acknowledge her, questions her right to be there, and humiliates her in front of other passengers. But just 10 minutes later, the flight crew is in for a shock they never saw coming. What happens next will leave everyone speechless. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if this story moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because together, our voices are stronger. Now, let's get into it. The airport was alive with movement. The kind of place where people are too busy looking at their watches to notice what's right in front of them. The shuffle of suitcases, the murmur of voices, the occasional burst of laughter from a child too young to know the world yet. All of it blended into a familiar hum. And yet, in the middle of it all, Eleanor Thomas stood still, not because she was lost, not because she was uncertain, but because she had learned, a long time ago, that the moment you step forward, you are seen, and when you are seen, you are judged. She knew this moment before it even happened. She had lived it 100 times before. Her first-class ticket was clutched between her fingers, the crisp edges pressing into her skin like a reminder, you belong here. And yet, she stepped to the counter, extended the ticket, and met the gate agent's gaze with steady eyes. The woman was young, blonde, and efficient in the way that people are when they have decided who matters and who does not. She took the ticket, paused, and that pause was everything. Because it was not a pause for protocol. Not a pause to check the system. It was a pause to decide. To decide if Eleanor belonged. To decide if she was the kind of person who sat in first class. Or if she was merely passing through. The woman's smile was thin, like a blade. I'm sorry, she said, tapping at the keyboard with a little too much emphasis. It looks like there's an issue with your upgrade. Eleanor breathed in. She had known this was coming. And yet, knowing did not make it easier. She waited for the next part of the game. The part where the woman did not look at her, but past her. The part where the small, cruel smirk would flicker onto her lips. And there it was. Like clockwork. The seat isn't available anymore, the woman said, her voice dripping with polite dismissal. She did not apologize. Because people like this never apologized. They simply expected you to accept. To accept the lie. To accept the unspoken message beneath it. To accept that you did not deserve to be here. Eleanor did not move. She had worked too hard for this moment. She had fought through rooms of men who had underestimated her. She had sat at tables where they did not want her to sit. And now, she would sit in this seat. Her voice was calm. I confirmed my upgrade yesterday, she said, and I have the receipt. The woman's smile did not falter. But something behind her eyes shifted. A flicker of annoyance. Because Eleanor had not folded. Because she had expected her to give up. Let me check again, the woman said, her tone just a little too sweet. But they both knew what she was doing. Eleanor could hear it in the exaggerated taps of the keyboard. She could see it in the way the woman's fingers hovered over the screen, pretending to look for something she had already decided would not be there. She could feel it in the way the air had changed. The way the people around them had begun to notice. To whisper. To steal glances but never interfere. And that was the real trick of moments like these. No one ever interfered. A man in a suit shifted uncomfortably a few feet away. A woman in line behind Eleanor glanced up. Then quickly back down at her phone. They all saw. But they did nothing. Because this was not their fight. And perhaps, somewhere deep inside, they already knew how it would end. Eleanor did not blink. She did not shift her weight. She simply waited. She had learned, long ago, that waiting could be power. That silence could be a weapon. The woman at the counter exhaled sharply, as if this was an inconvenience to her. I'm sorry, but you'll have to take a seat in economy, she said, her voice sharper now. A conclusion, not an option. And just like that, it was decided. Because she had decided it. Eleanor felt it then. That old familiar heat rising in her chest. That knowing. That weight. Because this moment was not about a seat. Not about a ticket. Not about an upgrade. It was about power. And power was a thing they never liked to give away. Eleanor tilted her head, her voice even. Let's not make this harder than it has to be. A challenge. A warning. A reminder. But the woman at the counter did not hear it. Or perhaps she did. And that was why she smiled so boldly now. A woman who had never been challenged before. A woman who believed she had already won. Well, she said, her eyes bright with quiet cruelty. I could always call security. And there it was. The real threat. The real cost of fighting back. The line that had always been waiting. And now, Eleanor had a choice to make. The words hung in the air like a threat wrapped in velvet. I could always call security. It was not a question. It was not even a warning. It was a reminder. One that had been whispered, shouted, and written into the bones of this country long before Eleanor Thomas had ever set foot in this airport. It was a reminder that, no matter the education, the money, the accomplishments, there was always a line. A line she was not meant to cross. A line that was not written down, but deeply understood. And now, here it was, standing before her in the shape of a blonde woman in a crisp airline uniform. Smiling just enough to make it hurt. Eleanor breathed in, slow and deep. She had seen this moment before. She had seen it in the eyes of a teacher who had once told her to be realistic about what she could become. She had seen it in the tight smiles of colleagues who praised her work but never quite trusted her ideas. She had seen it in the way doors opened for others with ease but for her only after a fight. And now, she saw it here, in a simple transaction that was no longer simple. This was not about a seat. It had never been about a seat. This was about who was allowed to belong. And the woman in front of her had decided. Eleanor did not. The performance of power. Eleanor could feel it happening now. The shift in the air. The unspoken agreement forming in the crowd around her. People were watching. Not helping. Not intervening. But watching. Because that was how these moments always worked. It was a performance. And the woman behind the counter knew her role well. She was not simply an airline worker. She was the gatekeeper. The enforcer of an old, invisible rule. And Eleanor? She was supposed to be the problem. She was supposed to be angry now. She was supposed to raise her voice. To let her frustration spill over so that everyone could sigh and nod and think to themselves. See? She's being difficult. But Eleanor did not raise her voice. She did not let them rewrite this moment before it had even ended. She smiled instead. It was a slow smile. One that did not touch her eyes. One that carried the weight of every slight. Every dismissal. Every time someone like this woman had tried to make her feel small. I think I'll wait for your supervisor instead. Eleanor said, her voice smooth. The woman's smirk faltered. Just for a second. She had not expected that. Had not expected Eleanor to be prepared for this fight. But before the woman could recover. Before she could say anything else. A man in a navy suit stepped forward. And suddenly, the game had changed. A system designed to protect itself. The supervisor was tall, balding, with the air of a man who had been called too many times for things that should have never needed his attention. He walked with impatience, his eyes scanning Eleanor as if already deciding how this would go. His name tag read Carl Peterson. And Carl Peterson did not like complications. What seems to be the problem? He asked. Already bored. The blonde agent answered before Eleanor could open her mouth. This passenger is disputing her seating arrangement. Disputing. As if Eleanor was being unreasonable. As if she had made a mistake. Not them. Carl sighed, glancing between Eleanor and the computer screen. His fingers tapped lazily at the keyboard. Then, he frowned. Because there it was. The receipt. The confirmation. The irrefutable proof. The first-class seat that had belonged to Eleanor all along. The blonde woman stiffened beside him. Carl Peterson's jaw tightened. Because now? Now this was a problem. Because if the seat was valid, then it meant something worse. It meant that someone had lied. And in this country, there was nothing more dangerous than a lie told against the wrong person. Carl cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. Looks like there was a mistake. A mistake. As if this was some harmless accident. As if this wasn't the exact same mistake that had been made in different ways for generations. Eleanor did not blink. She did not move. She simply waited. Waited for him to do what he had hoped he wouldn't have to do. The moment of reckoning. Carl turned to the blonde agent. His voice low. Fix it. The woman hesitated. She wanted to push back. But there was no way out now. She tapped at the keyboard, avoiding Eleanor's gaze. And finally, the ticket was reissued. Your seat is in first class, Carl said. His tone clipped. But there was no apology. No acknowledgement. Just the cold efficiency of a system forced to correct itself. And that was the part that stung the most. Because even when they were wrong, they never had to say it. Even when the truth was undeniable, they never had to admit what they had done. Eleanor took the ticket. And she smiled again. Not because she was happy, but because she wanted them to remember this moment. Because next time, they might think twice. And because next time, it might not be her standing here. It might be someone who didn't have the words, the patience, or the power to fight back. And so, as she walked toward the gate, her back straight, her heels clicking against the airport floor, she carried something with her. The weight of every battle like this one. The knowledge that this would not be the last. And yet, she walked forward anyway, because that's what they never expected her to do. Because that, in the end, was the real victory. Eleanor Thomas had won. Or at least, she had won this battle. She held her first-class ticket now. The confirmation of her rightful place in her fingers. And yet, the fight was not over. Because it never really was. Because when you force the system to acknowledge you, when you make them correct the mistakes that were never mistakes at all, it does not forgive you for your victory. It remembers. And it waits. And now, as Eleanor stepped onto the jet bridge, she could feel it waiting for her. It was in the way the air seemed thicker, heavier, pressing against her shoulders like something unseen but deeply felt. It was in the way the flight attendant at the door barely looked at her. Her greeting clipped, professional, but not warm. It was in the way that first-class passengers had already turned their heads, their eyes flicking toward her, measuring her, wondering just what kind of mistake had been made that allowed her to walk down this aisle. Because they had seen it before. The moment when someone like Eleanor took a seat they were not expected to take. The moment when the balance, however slightly, was upset. She knew what came next. She had always known. An unwritten order. First class was a world away from the rest of the plane. The seats wider, the air cooler, the service quieter, a space carved out for those who were used to being comfortable. And yet, comfort was not something given freely. It was something you had to prove you were worthy of. Eleanor moved through the aisle. Her pace measured. She could feel the stares. But no one spoke. Because no one had to. Because silence had a language all its own. The flight attendant, a tall woman with dark hair pulled into a severe bun, stood near Eleanor's seat. She was checking tickets. Checking them too carefully. Her fingers lingered over each one. Her eyes flicking from paper to screen. From screen to passenger. As if looking for something. Anything. To be out of place. And then, she saw Eleanor. And that was the moment everything shifted. It was in the slight narrowing of her eyes. The tightening of her lips. The way her fingers hesitated before moving to the next person. As if the simple act of seeing Eleanor in this space required a recalibration of some long-established rule. And Eleanor saw it, too. She saw the choice being made in real time. A choice not to welcome her, but to remind her. A different kind of turbulence. Eleanor reached her seat. She was about to settle in when the flight attendant stepped forward. "Excuse me, ma'am," the woman said, her voice smooth, her smile tight. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" It was not a question. It was a test. Because when they cannot remove you, they will try to make you remove yourself. Eleanor did not blink, did not sign, did not give this woman the satisfaction of seeing even a flicker of emotion on her face. Instead, she reached for her ticket. Slow, deliberate, and held it out. The flight attendant took it. And there was that pause again. The same one from the gate. The same one from the counter. The pause where power was calculated and reassessed. "One moment," the flight attendant said. And just like that, the game began again. She stepped away, leaving Eleanor standing in the aisle. Forcing her to remain visible. forcing her to be an interruption, a disruption, something to be noticed. The whispers started almost immediately. A man in a blue suit and cufflinks glanced up from his tablet. His expression blank but his posture shifting. A woman with perfectly coiffed hair and pearl earrings lowered her magazine just slightly. Her lips pursed. The man across the aisle let out a quiet exhale, as if this was already exhausting for him. And the plane had yet to take off. Eleanor stood there, and she waited, and she knew, deep in her bones, that this was the part that always hurt the most. Not the words spoken, but the ones left unsaid. Not the direct attacks, but the subtle humiliations, the small wounds that added up until they became something else entirely. A history, a weight, something you carry with you, even when you do not want to. The moment of decision. The flight attendant returned. This time, she had a different smile. A polite, professional, well-rehearsed smile. There was just a little confusion. She said lightly, "But everything is fine now." And just like that, she handed back Eleanor's ticket. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a carefully placed performance, meant to make everyone around them believe that nothing had happened at all. Because that was the final trick. To make Eleanor feel like she had imagined it. Like it was all in her head. But Eleanor knew better. Because this had not been about a seat. And this had not been a mistake. This had been a reminder. A reminder that the rules are different for people like her. A reminder that even when you win, they will find a way to make you feel like you lost. Eleanor took her seat. She adjusted her bag carefully. Deliberately, as if claiming the space with her presence alone. And then, she exhaled, because she was here now. And no one was going to move her. But as she gazed out of the window, the runway stretching out before them, she felt something else settle into her bones. This was not the end. There was still more to come. Because some people do not like to lose. And some people will do anything to remind you that they are still in control. Even at 35,000 feet in the air. Eleanor sat still, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. To an untrained eye, she looked comfortable, at ease, but this was not easy. It was poise, a practiced, deliberate posture. Because in moments like these, when the battle is not over, just shifting, you must be ready. Ready for the next insult disguised as policy. The next humiliation wrapped in procedure. The next challenge waiting just beneath the surface of civility. Because the thing about a system built to keep you in your place is that it does not forgive you for resisting. And today, Eleanor had resisted twice. And she could feel it now. Like a storm waiting in the wings. The sound of dismissal. The plane had not yet taken off. But the air had already grown tense. Not because of turbulence, but because of what had already transpired. The gate agent, the seat dispute, the flight attendants, confusion. People had seen it unfold. And now, they were deciding what to do with that knowledge. Some had already chosen their side. The man across the aisle, the one in the blue suit, had let out another sigh. As if the mere presence of Eleanor had somehow made his flight less pleasant. The woman with the pearl earrings had settled deeper into her seat. Her lips tight, her gaze flicking toward Eleanor before quickly looking away. But it was the man in seat 3A who made his stance clear. He was older, maybe in his 70s, with silver hair and a crisp white button-down. His voice carried the kind of unshakable confidence that comes from knowing the world was built for men like him. And so, when he spoke, he did so with authority. Some people just don't know their place anymore. He muttered, not to Eleanor directly, but loud enough for her to hear. Loud enough to test whether she would react. And when she didn't, he smiled. Because he had been waiting for this moment. Because this was a game to him. Because men like him have always known that power is not just about having it, but about making sure others know they do not. The woman beside him tensed slightly, but said nothing, because that was how this worked. 2. Silence was not just a shield. It was a weapon. And now, the first attack has been made. The rules of engagement. Eleanor turned, slow, deliberate, until her eyes met his. And that, more than anything, seemed to unnerve him. Because he had not expected to be seen. Because that was part of the game. 2. People like him could say things like this without consequences. Because no one was supposed to challenge them. Because they were not supposed to be held accountable. And so, Eleanor did the one thing he had not anticipated. She smiled. A slow, steady smile. The kind that does not concede. The kind that does not retreat. The kind that lets a man know that his power is an illusion. And that deep down, he knows it too. Are you speaking to me? She asked. Her voice calm. The man blinked, caught between arrogance and uncertainty. He had not expected a response. And that was the moment when the dynamic shifted again. Because now, it was his move, the currency of discomfort. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he shook his head. I was just making an observation, he said, his voice even. And Eleanor? She nodded. I see, she said. And she left it at that. Not because she did not have more to say, but because she understood something far more important. Sometimes, the greatest power lies not in arguing, but in forcing a man to sit with his own words. To let them settle. To let them fester. Because discomfort is a powerful thing. And now, the discomfort belonged to him. The repercussions of defiance. The plane had begun its slow taxi down the runway. But the tension had not broken. Because the thing about moments like this is that they do not pass quickly. The man in 3A had shifted in his seat now. His posture no longer so sure. And across the aisle, the man in the blue suit had set down his tablet. As if suddenly uncertain about where this was going. The flight attendant, the one who had doubted Eleanor's seat in the first place, had seen it all, and she did not like it. Because Eleanor had done something that people like her were never supposed to do. She had held her ground. She had forced a moment of reckoning. And some people? They do not like that. They like control. And when it is taken from them, even for a moment, they will find a way to take it back. And so, just as Eleanor was beginning to settle, the flight attendant reappeared. This time, with a different expression. This time, not with confusion, but with authority. Ma'am, she said, her voice carrying just a little too much weight. There seems to be an issue with your ticket after all. And there it was. The next battle. The next test. Because when you refuse to be put in your place, they will find another way to remind you. And so, Eleanor exhaled. She had expected this. She had seen it too many times before. But that didn't make it any less exhausting. Or any less cruel. And yet, she did not move. Because she was not going anywhere. And if they were going to try and take this seat from her, they were going to have to do it in the full light of day. With the entire world watching. Eleanor did not move. The flight attendant stood over her now. Her posture stiff. Her voice clipped with manufactured authority. There seems to be an issue with your ticket after all. The words carried the weight of something unspoken. Because they were not just about a seat. Not just about a ticket. Not just about a mistake. No. This was about power. This was about who gets to belong. And who must prove they do. Again and again and again. This was about control. And Eleanor? She knew this game too well. She had played it before. And she had learned. The only way to win was not to play at all. The smiling threat. An issue with my ticket? Eleanor repeated. Her voice smooth. Measured. She did not look up at the flight attendant right away. She took her time. Because they always expected you to be afraid. Expected you to scramble. To panic. To fold under the weight of their certainty. And Eleanor? She was in no rush. She adjusted the cuff of her blouse. She folded her hands neatly over her lap. And only then did she lift her eyes. That's strange, she said, tilting her head slightly. Because your colleague just confirmed that everything was in order. The flight attendant blinked. For half a second, something flickered across her face. A brief crack in the performance. And then, it was gone. Replaced by the same professional smile. The kind that wasn't meant to be reassuring. But to remind you who was in charge. Let me check again, she said, her voice smooth as glass. Would you mind stepping into the aisle for a moment? It was not a request. It was a command disguised as a courtesy. And Eleanor knew it. Because this was the next part of the game. Because when they cannot take your seat, they will try to take your dignity instead. The eyes that watch. Eleanor stayed seated. The cabin was silent now. People had noticed. They always noticed. But the thing about these moments, noticing is not the same as intervening. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others pretended to be absorbed in their phones. Because that is how it always worked. Didn't it? The performance of ignorance. The safety of silence. Across the aisle, the man in the blue suit had lowered his tablet. His mouth pressed into a thin line. The woman with pearl earrings tapped her perfectly manicured nails against the armrest. Her gaze flicking between Eleanor and the flight attendant. And the man in seat 3A. The one who had muttered about knowing your place. Had settled back into his seat now. Watching with undisguised amusement. Eleanor saw all of it. She felt all of it. Because the truth is, racism does not always arrive with burning crosses or slurs spat in the dark. Sometimes, it is quieter, more precise. A carefully placed pause. A question asked with just enough doubt. A demand wrapped in politeness. And now, it is happening here, at 35,000 feet. The moment of refusal. Eleanor smiled. It was a small thing. But it was everything. I'm comfortable where I am, she said simply. It was a choice. To stay seated. To remain unmoved. And that was enough to shift the entire balance of power. Because now the flight attendant had to decide. She had played her part. She had extended her command with a smile. But Eleanor had refused. And that was not supposed to happen. Because the rules of the game only work when people agree to play. Now, the flight attendant's smile has thinned. The tension stretched between them. And the question that had been hanging in the air all along finally took shape. Who will back down first? Who will force the other to move? And who will win? The whisper of power. The flight attendant's voice dropped lower. Ma'am, I really must insist. Quote. And that was when Eleanor saw him. The captain. Standing at the front of the cabin. Watching. His uniform crisp. His expression unreadable. But she could see the calculation in his eyes. He had been notified. Had been brought into this little game. Because when you push back twice. When you refuse to fold. They call in someone bigger. Someone with more authority. Someone who can end the dispute. And Eleanor exhaled. Because she knew. She knew what was coming next. Because some people do not accept defeat. And if they cannot make you feel small, they will find another way to remind you who is really in control. And at 35,000 feet, that power could be dangerous. The hum of the engines filled the cabin. A low vibration pressing against Eleanor's ribs. She remained seated, steady, poised, unmoved. But the air around her had shifted. The flight attendant, still standing over her, was no longer just an attendant. She had become a gatekeeper. A personification of the silent rules. The ones unspoken but understood. And now, the captain stood in the aisle. His uniform was pristine. His expression was measured. But Eleanor had learned, long ago, that power does not need to raise its voice to make itself heard. The passengers were watching now. Not just noticing, but truly watching. Some uncomfortable, some curious, and some, like the man in 3A, looking all too satisfied, because he had seen this before. Because men like him have always understood the ways the world reminds certain people of their place. And today, Eleanor was meant to be reminded. The dance of authority. The captain's voice was calm when he spoke. But not neutral. Ma'am, my crew has informed me of a seating issue. The words were deliberate. Framed carefully. Not a mistake. Not discrimination. Just a seating issue. A misunderstanding. A technicality. But Eleanor knew better. She had seen this tactic before. When you refuse to be small, they reframe the narrative. They turn your dignity into a disruption. They turn their discomfort into your problem. She lifted her gaze to meet his. What exactly is the issue? Captain? She asked. Her voice smooth, measured. The silence in the cabin stretched. The captain hesitated for a fraction of a second. Because that was not the response he had expected. Because Eleanor had not defended herself. Had not apologized. Had not scrambled to justify her presence. She had simply asked a question. And that forced him to answer. The weight of the question. The captain shifted slightly. And in that moment, Eleanor saw it. The crack. The flicker of something behind his eyes. Not quite guilt. Not quite doubt. But awareness. Because he knew. Because everyone in that cabin knew. This was not about a seat. This was about who was sitting in it. We've been informed that there may have been an error in your ticketing process. He finally said. His voice was still calm. Still authoritative. But there was a difference now. A subtle shift. Because Eleanor had done something unexpected. She had made him explain himself. She had forced him to own the moment. And that? That was dangerous. Because power only works when people accept it without question. And Eleanor? She was asking questions. The cost of refusal. The flight attendant still stood beside him. Her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She wasn't smiling anymore. She was waiting. For the captain to reassert control. For Eleanor to finally comply. For the balance of power to shift back where it belonged. But Eleanor had already decided. She was not moving. Not because of defiance. Not because of pride. But because if she gave in now, the lesson would be clear. That they could still do this. That they could still strip her dignity away. And get away with it. And she would not allow that. Captain, Eleanor said. Her voice still even. Let me clarify something. I purchased this seat. I checked in properly. My ticket was verified. So, unless there is an actual issue with the airline's system, I will be remaining where I am. She let the words settle. And the moment stretched long enough for the entire plane to hear it. No one moved. Not the man in 3A. Whose amusement had faded slightly. Not the woman in pearl earrings. Who had suddenly become very interested in the view outside the window. Not the passengers in the back. Whose whispered conversations had now stopped completely. Because now, it was no longer just about Eleanor and the airline. It was about Eleanor and the entire plane. And people were finally being forced to decide. Would they pretend not to see? Or would they acknowledge what was happening right in front of them? The shift in the air. The captain took a slow breath. He understood the danger now. The danger of letting this continue. Of letting this be seen. The airline could afford to lose one seat. What they could not afford was for this story to leave the plane. For headlines to be written. For videos to go viral. For the world to see a black woman standing her ground. While those in power tried to take it away. Because this was not a private moment anymore. This was history repeating itself. One more time. And this time, people were watching. The captain turned to the flight attendant. His voice was quiet. Is her ticket valid? The question was simple. And Eleanor watched the flight attendant hesitate. Watch her lips part. Then press back together. Because now, she had to answer honestly. Because anything else could be recorded. Could be remembered. Could become something much bigger than she was prepared for. So finally, she nodded. Yes, she muttered. The tension snapped. The captain exhaled. A sharp, frustrated thing. Then I see no reason why this passenger cannot remain where she is. He said. His voice clipped. And just like that, it was over. But not really. Because it is never just about the seat. Because Eleanor had won this battle. But the war had been there long before she stepped on the plane. And she had felt every bit of it. The aftermath. The flight attendant walked away stiffly. Her jaw tight. The captain gave a curt nod and turned back to the cockpit. And slowly, the cabin began to move again. The man in 3A shifted. But said nothing. The woman with pearl earrings let out a soft breath. Almost relieved. And Eleanor? She sat there. Exactly where she had always belonged. But something had changed. Because even though the flight had yet to take off, Eleanor had already won something far greater than just a seat. She had won the simple right to exist in the space she had earned. And she had forced them to admit it. For now, that would have to be enough. Because victory does not always arrive with celebration. Sometimes, it arrives with quiet survival. And at 35,000 feet, that was more than enough. At 35,000 feet, the world below looked peaceful. Clouds drifted in the soft glow of the late afternoon sun, casting long shadows over the expanse of sky. But inside the cabin, Eleanor knew, the battle was not over. Because racism does not sleep when the doors close. Because it does not dissolve in the recycled air of a first-class cabin. It lingers. It waits. And Eleanor could feel it in the silence. The weight of defiance. The attendants still moved through the aisles. But their steps were different now. Tighter. Sharper. Like the forced grace of a performance they had not rehearsed for. The one who had tried to remove her, Michelle, her name tag read, had not returned to her section. Instead, another woman, softer in manner but no less aware of the tension, took her place. Miss Patterson, can I get you something to drink? She asked. Her voice carefully neutral. Eleanor lifted her gaze. Just water, thank you. The woman nodded. But Eleanor could see it in her eyes. The quiet discomfort of someone caught in the middle of a moment too large for them to control. Because the hierarchy of power had shifted. For the first time, they had been forced to yield. And power never forgets when it has been challenged. A seat at the table. But not welcome to dine. Across the aisle, the man in 3A still watched her. His posture was relaxed. But there was something else now. A calculation. A question forming in his mind. One he would never ask aloud. How did she win? Because men like him do not like to see a system fail in its design. They do not like to see one of the exceptions slip through the cracks. He smirked, just slightly, and leaned toward her as the flight attendant stepped away. You must be someone important. He mused, his voice dripping with amusement. Most people wouldn't have fought that hard for a seat. Eleanor exhaled slowly, turning her head toward him. Most people shouldn't have to. A pause. A shift. A realization. This was not a conversation he could control. But men like him do not surrender easily. You know, he said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. There's a way to handle these things. Discretion goes a long way. Discretion. The favored tool of those who have never been denied their dignity. The unspoken rule that if you do not make a scene, they will allow you to keep your place. Temporarily. Eleanor let a small, knowing smile touch her lips. Is that what you do? She asked. When something is taken from you, do you whisper about it in the corner and hope it gets returned? The smirk on his face faltered. Just slightly. Because the truth of power is this. It does not respect silence. It respects force. What they fear. The turbulence came suddenly. A sharp jolt that rattled the glasses on their trays. The overhead lights flickered momentarily. A reminder that even in the sky, control is an illusion. A flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has turned on the seatbelt sign. Please remain seated. Eleanor took in the irony of it. Remain seated. That was all they had ever wanted from her. To stay in her place. Do not push too hard. Do not reach too high. But the thing about turbulence is this. It does not ask permission to shake things up. And neither would she. The man in 3A exhaled, shaking his head with amusement. You people love making everything about race. He muttered under his breath. Eleanor turned her head fully toward him now. Her expression cool but sharp as glass. You people? She echoed. Her voice dangerously soft. For the first time, he hesitated. Because he had expected her to be tired. To be weary. To let it slide. But she was none of those things. Tell me, she continued, tilting her head slightly. What exactly do you think this was about? He chuckled, shifting in his seat. Oh, I don't know. Maybe someone made a mistake. And you turned it into a whole ordeal. That's what you people do. Find something to be offended about. And there it was. The mask sleeping. The truth. Unvarnished. Because when their systems fail, they do not examine the system. They blame the person who refused to be crushed by it. A quiet reckoning. Eleanor took a sip of water. Then, with deliberate slowness, she leaned toward him just slightly. You don't have to understand what happened today, she said, but you will remember it. A flicker of something crossed his face. Annoyance? Recognition? Fear? It didn't matter. Because the truth had already settled between them. Undeniable. Immovable. He had tried to dismiss her. But she had refused to disappear. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled him. Because there is nothing more terrifying to people like him than a black woman who refuses to be erased. And Eleanor? She was still here. Still seated. Still unmoved. The landing will come. The turbulence passed. The plane steadied. The seatbelt sign flicked off with a soft chime. But Eleanor knew the landing had not yet come. Because battles like these do not end when the flight does. Because some fights follow you home. And when the wheels finally touched the ground, she would have to decide. Would she walk away in quiet satisfaction? Or would she make sure the story did not end here? The answer, she already knew. Because some people live their whole lives asking permission to exist. And Eleanor? She had never been one of them. The landing was smooth, but Eleanor knew better. Racism does not crash into you like a falling plane. It lands softly, its wheels kissing the runway, pretending there was never any turbulence at all. The passengers around her stretched, yawned, reached for their overhead bags, eager to return to their lives. For them, the flight was over. For Eleanor, the fight had only just begun. The long walk through the terminal. She stepped off the plane, her heels clicking softly against the polished airport floor. People rushed past her, moving with the kind of freedom that comes with knowing you belong. She thought about the man in 3A. How he had smirked. How he had twisted her resistance into something inconvenient. How he had expected her to let it go. She thought about the flight attendant, Michelle, who had denied her, dismissed her, reduced her to an error rather than a person. And then she thought about herself. The weight of what it meant to push back. The exhaustion of it. Because fighting for dignity should not be a full-time job. And yet, for people like Eleanor, it always was. The reckoning arrives. At the gate, a uniformed airline manager stood waiting. A man in his 50s. White. His face set in careful neutrality. The kind worn by those who know they are about to apologize but don't yet know how to mean it. Beside him, Michelle stood stiff, her arms folded. And behind them, a woman with sharp eyes and a tailored suit. The airline's regional director. Eleanor exhaled, her spine straightening. Because now, they would try to explain themselves. Now, they would try to fix what had been broken without acknowledging they had broken it. The manager cleared his throat. Miss Patterson, may I have a word? The theater of apology. They led her to a private lounge. A place of controlled damage. Where problems were meant to be erased before they reached the public. The regional director motioned for her to sit. Eleanor did not. I want to first sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding earlier today. The woman began. Eleanor let the words hang in the air. She had heard them before. A misunderstanding. As if bias were an accident. As if racism were an occasional inconvenience rather than a deeply rooted design. A misunderstanding. Eleanor repeated, her voice even. Tell me, what exactly was misunderstood? The manager shifted uncomfortably. We've reviewed the situation, and it appears there was an error in communication. The flight attendant was under the impression that, quote, no, Eleanor interrupted. Michelle was under the impression that I did not belong. Michelle's jaw tightened. Eleanor turned to her now. Her eyes sharp. You saw a black woman in first class. And you assumed I had made a mistake. You assumed I had taken something I wasn't entitled to. And when I proved you wrong, you doubled down. Isn't that right? Michelle's lips parted slightly, but she had no words. Because she had never expected to be held accountable. The regional director cleared her throat. Miss Patterson, please understand, we take these matters very seriously. We will be conducting an internal review. Quote. Eleanor smiled. A slow, knowing smile. No, you won't, she said, her voice almost soft. You will do what you always do. You will wait for the moment to pass. You will tell yourselves that this was unfortunate but not systemic. And you will move on. The room fell silent. Because what do you say to the truth? Power is not given, it is taken. Here's what's going to happen. Eleanor continued, stepping forward. You will not sweep this under the rug. You will not write this off as a training issue. You will not pretend that what happened to me today was anything less than what it was. Discrimination. The regional director shifted uncomfortably. Miss Patterson, I assure you, quote, I don't need assurances, Eleanor said. I need accountability. And then, she placed her phone on the table, pressed play, and let the recording play aloud. The entire flight interaction. Michelle's refusal. The gate agent's smirk. The man in 3A's scoff. The gasps. The whispers. The undeniable evidence that had been carefully documented, time-stamped, and ready to go viral. The manager went pale. Michelle's mouth pressed into a thin, trembling line. The regional director inhaled sharply, understanding, finally, what she was up against. This wasn't just about fixing it. This was about making it right before the world saw what had already happened. The price of change. What do you want? The regional director asked. Her voice tight. Eleanor took her time answering. Because this was the moment they feared. A black woman with proof. A black woman with power. I want a written apology. Eleanor said. Not just to me, but to every passenger on that flight who witnessed what happened. I want mandatory anti-bias training for your entire staff. Pilots, gate agents, flight attendants, managers, everyone. And I want Michelle here removed from customer service. Michelle gasped. You can't be serious. Quote. Eleanor turned to her. I was serious when I bought my ticket. I was serious when I took my seat. And I am serious now. The regional director exhaled sharply, then nodded. We'll arrange it, she said. All of it. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. Because change does not come through hope. It comes through force. It comes when the unspoken is spoken. When injustice is named aloud. And when the people who thrive on silence realize that silence is no longer an option. The walk away. Eleanor did not wait for the meeting to end. She did not linger for their rehearsed words. Their half-hearted attempts to lessen the damage. She turned, her heels clicking against the marble floors as she walked away. Because they would not forget her. Because the next time they saw a black woman in first class, they would think twice. Because justice, once demanded, cannot be undone. And Eleanor? She had just rewritten the rules. Epilogue. The flight will continue. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the night sky. Eleanor stepped into the waiting car. Her body heavy with exhaustion but her mind alight. The email from the airline would arrive within hours. The statement, the promises. Some would call it a victory. But Eleanor knew better. Because racism does not die in a single battle. Because systems do not dismantle themselves. Because this fight would not end here. And yet, as the car pulled away, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. Because today, she had not just won a seat. She had claimed something much larger. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, she will fight again.